What's going on, everyone? My name's Tenebris Infinite, and welcome to Weapon Shootouts in Generation Zero, where I'll be comparing two guns and seeing which of them is the better option in the game. I've done tons of weapon comparisons in the past, but with so many new weapons added, and more to come along the way, there are tons of new questions popping up. And with these weapon shootouts, my aim is to answer these questions and then some, comparing damage values, recoil and accuracy, stealth capabilities, vehicle destruction, and much, much more. If you like these comparisons, slap a comment or leave a like on the video so I can know whether or not this is the sort of thing you dudes will want more of in the future here. Today, we're starting off with a really spicy comparison, one I've actually been very curious about myself. Which is better in the game, the AG5 or the N16? Two very similar rifles, but will one be the clear better option, or will these rifles come out completely identical in the end? They both use 5.56 rounds, and are more focused on accuracy in Generation Zero than pure damage output, being used more for pinpointing components with full auto fire than putting machines down with damage alone. More of a thinking man's rifle than guns a-blazing approach. So today, we'll put these two rifles through the tests that I've come up with to compare these guns in depth, and we'll see if there is a clear victor here come the end of it. The first baseline comparison we can draw between the AG5 and the N16 are in the stats. The damage stat remains the same between the two weapons, but the handling and the rate of fire drops for the N16. When we get into the damage, we're going to talk about what that actually means in terms of numbers on the machine later on, but for the handling and the rate of fire, this is most likely related to the N16's slightly more cumbersome full reload animation versus the Automat Yavars. So for the next test, we're going to be talking about damage ranges, and what I mean by damage ranges are what sort of damage you're going to be seeing from the gun with a specific type of ammunition used for its specific purpose. So that means that hollow point and soft point ammunition will be used only for components, full metal jackets will be used primarily for components, armor piercing will be used primarily for armor, and then experimental ammo we'll get into later on in this video. We're going to be using my Vanguard for testing this all out, so that means that I have the maximum amount of recoil control and the maximum amount of damage in full auto fire, but also kind of respectively the lowest amount of damage in semi-auto, no boosts to that. So a rule of thumb here in Generation Zero is that once you go into full auto, you almost essentially have the damage that you're able to put out with a single bullet, whereas when you're in semi-auto, you obtain kind of the full damage potential. So when you have a character build that has the maximum full auto fire, you essentially are getting the same damage range from your semi-auto fire on your full auto fire. Versus if you were to upgrade your semi-auto fire, it would then just become that much more powerful. The damage range for an armor-piercing round of a 5.56 into a heavy piece of armor like a tank front plate does roughly around 9 to 11% damage. For a component that I like to use as a baseline, I like to use the tank fuel cell, because the tank fuel cell has a pretty large health pool for a component, but on the other hand is pretty lightly armored too. So you get to kind of see a damage ratio pretty well off for it that isn't going to just outright blow it up like, say, for a hunter fuel cell or a runner fuel cell. And as we can see here, the damage range is anywhere from like 7 to 8% at a point blank hit for 5.56 on a unarmored component. It's a little bit hard to see while he's moving around, so I'm going to freeze frame it here. Now what does that 7 to 8% look like in terms of a runner? Well, that means 3 shots to the runner's fuel cell is going to take it down from 100% to nothing percent. Now, as we had talked about in the stats earlier, the damage potential for the N16 and the AG5 is the exact same. So actually what came from all of this testing was just clear confirmation on that the AG5 and the N16 are 100% identical when it comes to how they output damage, their damage drop off, and everything in that aspect. But there still are some very interesting differences between these two guns here. We'll get into those in just a little bit here. The one major thing that differentiates the damage potential between the N16 and the AG5 is the N16's burst fire capability. The burst fire does not take a benefit from either of the stats in the game, so there's no method of increasing burst fire damage as of right now. But burst fire itself is a very interesting thing where all of the shots take semi-automatic damage. So that's the higher damage potential versus semi-auto and full auto. So burst fire is still a very functionable approach, especially if you have a character that doesn't have any damage perks at all. So where do the differences start to kick in for the N16 and the AG5? And they start to kick in an aspect of stealth. Not so much in the kill potential of stealth, as I'm showing in this video here. The ability to kill machines well in stealth and maintain that incognito status is pretty easy to pull off with both of these guns, respectively. There's no real differences there. But there is a difference in something that I like to call missed shot leeway, and we'll talk about that in a second here. But for now, let's talk about stealth in Generation 0 for just a quick second. So stealth in Generation 0 relies on two things: your volume output of the weapons that you're using, as well as the movement that you're making, as well as line of sight. As long as you do not have absolutely clear line of sight from the machines to you, the machines will not be able to immediately detect your position. They will be able to detect your position if you are partially visible, or if you are not completely concealed. As well, there is a hive mind aspect, so if one of the machines clearly spots you, a lot of times the other machines will also clearly know where you're at. But the other aspect is your volume output, and the main way you can control this is by slapping on a silencer onto your gun, or a suppressor onto your gun. And utilizing the amount of sound that you generate, you can draw machines in, and you can kind of control the ebb and flow of stealth. As you can see here, again, utilizing something that is clearly blocking machine line of sight to you. You can hear here in the background that they're actively scanning for me. I'll stop talking for a quick second. So that doggo had no idea where I actually was, even though he had been aggroed to this location because of me engaging the machines and blowing them up. He had no clear line of sight, and he had no idea where my sound was being kind of like emitted from due to the suppressor. The N16 functions much in the same way that the AG5 does for its stealth capabilities. Again, their damage potential is the same, so it's not like you're going to be killing machines any faster with either gun versus one another. But the interesting thing comes into missed shot leeway, which we'll get into just after this little clip here, me clowning around with some doggos. Now, another thing too that you can probably tell from the footage here, you don't need to kill the machine immediately in order to get a stealth kill. You do actually have a few seconds where you can still continuously engage the machine and damage the machine and remain in stealth. It's kind of one of those things that you need to get used to. Stealth in Generation 0 is not quite the same as stealth in your typical video game, because you aren't fighting against normal human enemies, you're fighting against machines, so they have, you know, abilities to kind of reflect that. Also, I got a kind of neat, sad doggo noise here. He's like, where the heck did my friends go? They were here 1 second and they're all dead. I didn't see nothing. What the heck, man? Now, allow me to demonstrate missed shot leeway to you dudes. Missed shot leeway is essentially the amount of rounds that you can miss towards a machine before he gets aware of the location that you're at. This might not be an actual thing in the game, it might just be a Tenebrisism that I've kind of come up with along the way here to make sense of the systems that we have in Generation Zero. But essentially, one of the things that I've noticed is that while you're in stealth, and while you're shooting at an enemy, there's a kind of certain amount of shots and a certain amount of, like, distance that you can take away from the machines while you're shooting around them. And they'll have various levels of being aware of you depending on, of course, whether or not you have a suppressor on your weapon and whether or not your weapon is overly a stealthy weapon in the first place. In this regard, weapons that use 556 feel much more stealthy than weapons that use 762. The missed shot leeway that you have with 556 is incredibly generous, whereas even though I do need to put like some actual serious testing into it, I really think that with the 762 you have far less missed shots that you can have. Now, of course, it's not like we're aiming to miss out here, but this is just in the happen chance that you do miss, or just in the happen chance that your shot does not land on the target. And as well, you can kind of see here that the missed shot leeway for the N16 is just marginally a little bit smaller than the AG5. Now, I tested this like probably 3 or 4 times, I'm just showing a couple clips here, but in the end, the N16 seemed to have just a little bit less missed shot leeway. Alright, so now for something that we can compare a little bit more directly as opposed to damage ranges or stealth potential, where that's kind of partially a matter of player skill as well. So here for the iron sights, in my opinion, the AG5 allows for better target acquisition within the iron sight, whereas the N16 has slightly kind of more widespread peripheral vision due to not having a kind of chunky box sitting right in front of your face. This is one of those things that could potentially just fall down to player preference. As well, you might not enjoy the tritium sights versus the N16 without the tritium sights. Personally, for me, I kind of enjoy the glowing sights. It adds a bit of prestige to the weapon, and also it kind of helps me focus in on that iron sight just a little bit. Now for the next bit, I'm going to call the 3 R's of guns: the recoil, the reload, and the rate of fire. So what we're going to be testing here is how the recoil handles, whether or not it's more horizontal or vertical recoil, how long the reloads take, and how many bullets we could pump out in the span of a minute. A similar test to what we've run in the past here on my channel. The reloads between these two guns may seem very, very similar on face value, but the N16 actually takes something like 15 more frames to complete its animation, which, if any of you dudes are serious video game nerds, you'll know that 15 frames can actually make a absolutely huge difference. So yeah, just kind of a funny little comparison between the two. The N16 has a slightly longer full reload sequence, though the partial reload is the exact same speed, and I think that we're going to find that for most assault rifles in the game. The place where you really see those 15 frames start to come into play is when you look at how many bullets you can dish out in the span of a minute with just pure full auto fire and reloading. Of course, you aren't going to be playing the game like this usually, but this is just kind of like a baseline test. So with the AG5, you'll be able to crank out maybe about 20 more rounds per minute in comparison to the N16, just simply due to the N16 having a slightly longer full reload animation. So lastly here for the recoil, we're doing a number of tests here. The first off is a compensation test where we look at how the recoil spans out as I compensate for the climb. Then next up, a no compensation test where I just let the gun climb naturally through its recoil. So using this, you can kind of see how the gun recoils. It's a very steady dispersion of rounds when you're compensating, and when you aren't compensating, there's some pretty high vertical climb that you can get from a full magazine. Now, again, just like the rounds per minute test, you're probably going to be compensating for your shots 9 times out of 10, but this is just to see how the weapon itself functions and how it handles at an absolute baseline. Now, the interesting information that I've been able to glean from this, and this is just something that I've kind of known for a while now, the American weapons and the Soviet weapons have far more horizontal recoil, whereas the base game weapons, the typical Swedish weapons, or at least most of them, have primarily vertical recoil. So with the DLC guns, a lot of times you're going to find guns moving along a horizontal plane, whereas a lot of times with the base guns, a lot of times you're going to find them recoiling along a vertical plane. So next up, we're going to be looking at the bullet drop for these two guns. And I have 2 tests, a 100 meter test and a 200 meter test. Sadly, we don't have the sort of range to do a longer test at this point in time in Generation 0. 200 is kind of the upper limit of how far you can get from a target, but hopefully in the future with new base building locations and possibly new base building features, we could see better long-range testing capabilities come to the game. Both of these guns are incredibly stable shooters at 100 meters and also at 200 meters, but the interesting difference is that I find the N16 to be a little bit more reliable at that 200 meter point than the AG5. So if you're into long-range shooting, maybe the N16 might be the better option between the two here. While I do this long-range test here, I'm just going to kind of mention 2 things that I really hope will come to base building just at some point as a thing for us to get more information in the game. I would love to see a damage counter, something that actually gives us like a number or something like that, so that way we could shoot the thing and see how much damage we're doing, especially damage drop-off over ranges. As well, it would be pretty awesome to see just a further target range, some sort of a really long, really big base that we could build at. Right now, our base building location is a pretty small area, so hopefully in the future we could get some things that will potentially tell us more inside details of damage, and maybe some things that we can use to set up long-range ranges here in the game. Now, for one of the hardest topics in Generation 0, damage drop-off. What is damage drop-off? And what is velocity? What does it all mean? So, velocity in the game is your bullet's ability to maintain its peak optimal damage, essentially increasing the range that you can have point-blank damage, and increasing the range in which case you can have effective damage on machines. A rule of thumb that I tend to follow is every 75 to 100 meters, you're dropping about 1% of damage overall to the specific thing that you're targeting. Now, again though, that is something where it's just my common sense of it. That's maybe not factual to the game itself, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb to follow if you're going to be thinking about damage percentages and how much damage you're actually dealing to the machines. Essentially what I'm saying here is like 200 meters, 300 meters and out, you want to be sniping the machines with some sort of a rifle or a sniper rifle, but within the 300 to 200, 100 meter range, you can use the assault rifle and expect much better forms of damage. For comparison here, or for like an instance here, you can see that at 200 meters out, we are doing just 5% damage to the fuel cell in comparison to the much higher amounts that we were doing earlier when we were point blank range. Damage in Generation 0 is rather relative to velocity, so a lot of times if you can see a higher damage potential in that bar, that also means that the weapon is going to have much better damage carry through over long distances. I'm kind of forgetting what video it was, but somewhere along the way in the past I had explained to you dudes that experimental ammo lines up with a certain type of ammo for each respective weapon. So with the 5.56 in particular, the corrosive lines up with armor-piercing rounds, whereas the heat rounds line up with full metal jackets. Each experimental ammo type has its own special effects to it. Explosive ammo will splash off damage to other components, whereas heat ammo will penetrate past the armor and do massive damage to components in behind it. The way corrosive works is, seemingly to me, it seems like what it does is it degrades that armor's ability to defend against further attacks. So once you've shot it with a corrosive round, you could stack up more corrosive rounds on it with repeated fire in order to break that armor piece rather quickly, or you could shoot off just a couple corrosive rounds and use normal ammunition to break that armor piece much faster, and potentially with not even the correct type of ammunition, using hollow points against armor and etc. And with heat rounds, it does massive damage to components, but on top of that, it will also pierce past armor to get to the components in behind it, which leads to some pretty interesting scenarios where you can take down machines without even destroying their armor in the process, just pinpointing components that are hidden behind armor pieces that would normally take a little bit of effort to take out. Personally, I greatly prefer the heat rounds to the corrosive rounds when it comes to 5.56. It just seems to have much more punch to it and a lot more visual impact. But outside of that, with the two weapons, similarly to all of the other damage potentials, they behave the exact same here. So there is no clear victor between the two weapons, but there is a clear victor for what experimental ammo you want to use with these guns. Okay, so for the second last test here, this is something that I like to call vehicle TTD, or time to destruction. So it's how long it takes to actually blow up a vehicle. And as you can see here, it takes around 30 bullets at the vehicle's weak point, which interestingly, the vehicle's weak point is in behind the front tires, more so kind of along the dashboard of the car, as opposed to the engine where you maybe would think it would be. There also is no superior round for destroying the car overall. Neither of the experimental ammo types benefit vehicle TTD. Some weapons come with explosive variants of experimental ammo, and some experimental weapons also have their own benefits to vehicle TTD. But when it comes to 5.56, really, you have to put in around 30 bullets, no matter what sort of ammunition you're using, provided you are targeting the vehicle's weak point. It's always good to keep TTD in mind when you're trying to blow up a vehicle, so that way you can ensure that you're actually going to destroy the vehicle and utilize it, as opposed to potentially spraying more bullets into the vehicle than you have to, or also potentially shooting a car, getting kind of fed up because it doesn't explode, wasting that ammunition, and then, like, moving on with your fight. So, yeah, keeping in mind vehicle TTD, I think, is very important, especially in any sort of urban situations where you're fighting against machines in some sort of a city. Now, for the last one, from the TTD to the TTK, the time to kill, how long it takes to kill a machine. And again, for the baseline, we're going to this poor friggin' prototype tank here. He's been punked on all day, so we're finally just gonna kill him outright here. And the time to kill for both of these guns is the exact same at 2 minutes for a prototype tank kill, which I think is a pretty solid baseline here. I kept both of these fights as identical as I possibly could, which is why I really like this tank spawn. He just gives the opportunity for you to have, like, repetitive testing scenarios where you could test things over and over and have at least as similar of a kind of control factor as possible in the testing. So, yeah, let's call this guy Ted the Tank. Ted the Tank, MVP here. Okay, and last for the day, the N16 time to kill. Again, keeping these fights as identical as possible, and both fights clocking in at only 2 minutes. I think that these two guns are very, very evenly matched. But, even though they're evenly matched, the minute differences between the two actually come into play in a big way. Especially one that I totally didn't expect to be the biggest glaring difference between the two, but the iron sight. I greatly prefer the AG5's larger iron sight for that, like, in-iron sight target acquisition. Sure, you do get better peripheral vision with the N16, but when you look down that iron sight, things can be a little bit blurry and distorted, just simply because it's such a, like, focal point. So, yeah, it's very interesting what this testing has kind of proven here along the way. Everything I do is all in skirmish mode. If any of you have been wondering the difficulty that I have it set to currently in the game, I prefer skirmish because it's the most authentic to the OG Generation Zero experience from the old days. On Guerrilla, obviously, numbers will be slightly less, and on Adventure, numbers for damages and stuff like that will be slightly more. Though factors like vehicle destruction and reload time and stuff like that all stay the same between all of your difficulties. So those are things that you can carry on over to your playthrough no matter where you have your difficulty set to. So, there we go. Probably way more thorough testing than is maybe necessary, but I really enjoyed doing it, actually. I enjoyed finding out all of these minute differences between two very similar guns. So, I would like to know, here at the tail end of the video, if you're still watching, what would you like to see as the next two guns that I have a shootout in between? Throw them up in the comments down below. I'm going to be getting to all the guns, but if you have anything in particular, I might be getting to it sooner. Who knows? But for now, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this was insightful and informative for you, and I will catch you all in the next one. Until then, peace out, my dudes.